Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us for Loving Someone Who Loves Alcohol or Drugs by Dr. Patt Denning. I'm Jeannie Little, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Harm Reduction Therapy. And I just have a few housekeeping announcements before I introduce Pat. The San Francisco Public Library is a co-sponsor of this event, and we thank them very much for their support. I believe they would like us to be moving out as soon after 7:30 as possible. We'll allow plenty of time for questions. The talk's being videotaped, as you can see, but we will not videotape the audience, and nor will we videotape anyone asking questions. So everybody should have gotten a little slip of cut-up paper. If you'd like to write down questions toward the end of Pat's talk, which will be about 45 minutes, staff here will collect them, and I will actually read them out so the questions themselves can be taped. And then if anybody is just asking questions spontaneously, Pat will repeat your questions. We have a bunch of materials, as you noticed. There are a few pamphlets that you can take and newsletters, that sort of thing that you can take. And otherwise, the books are just here for you to peruse them and decide if they would be something you'd be interested in. They're by a variety of authors in the harm reduction field, including Pat and myself. Let's see, the restrooms are on the next floor. They do exist on this floor, but they're closed. So, hi. So they go up the stairs or go up this little elevator here and then ask directions, because they're not so easy to find. And also this talk will be repeated next week on Wednesday at 5:30 at the Oakland Public Library, downtown Oakland. So in case you know anybody who missed it today and would like to come next week. So now to Dr. Patt Denning. Pat is a clinical psychologist and a psychopharmacologist. She is also the co-founder and director of clinical services and training for the Center for Harm Reduction Therapy. She began her work in San Francisco in the 1970s, working with seriously mentally ill folks at Baker Places, which some of you might be aware of, a large mental health agency here, community mental health agency. And then in 1983, she took a job as the director of the mental health team at Health Center 1, run by the Department of Public Health, in the Castro. And this was actually the ground zero clinic during the first 10 years of the HIV epidemic. And as the director of mental health there, she and the team started seeing a lot more people who were using and abusing alcohol and other drugs. They tried referring them to drug treatment, and then Pat figured out really pretty quickly that not all problematic substance use is actually driven by addiction. And in the case of the people that they were working with at the clinic, their substance use was being driven by devastating grief and trauma over this mysterious illness that was taking out an entire community. So at that point, she started developing a new model of treatment that would integrate psychotherapy with more up-to-date, evidence-based models of substance abuse treatment so that she could actually treat people's substance use issues as well as the issues that lie behind them. And that became, she joined the harm reduction movement in the 1990s, and her model became harm reduction therapy. So, and then in 2000, she co-founded the Center for Harm Reduction Therapy, and at this point, our organization...
With Jeannie Little.
Yeah, with me. And that's whatever. And our organization at this point, 15 years on, works with about 1,000 individuals and families every year, some of whom come to our therapy offices in San Francisco or Oakland, and the rest of whom we see in a number of community-based organizations. Here, I was going to say here in the Tenderloin, we're almost in the Tenderloin. On 6th Street, we do outreach and actually do psychotherapy with kids in Golden Gate Park. And we also work in the San Mateo County AIDS programs. So To come to why we're here tonight, in the last 10 years, Pat has developed a specialization in working with families. And while this is somewhat ironic to those of us who know her well, because she has a well-declared ambivalence about families, which I'm sure we can all relate to in some way. She's really dedicated to everyone involved in the life of a substance user, everyone actually understanding this model, which is very life-saving and very forgiving. So she has really developed quite a passion for working with families, and that's what she's going to talk with us about. So with no further ado, I give you Pat.
Thanks. Hi, folks. It is nice and cool in here, so I hope to heat things up a little bit with some interesting conversation, but maybe not. So why, I always like to try and figure out, why am I here? What am I doing? You know, I'm here because I've been a therapist for 40 years. I mean, Jeannie talked a little bit about that. And I was never really trained in substance abuse per se. But I developed that specialty over the last 20 years in large measure because of the HIV epidemic and what I saw happening within the community of initially gay men in San Francisco. And then after a while, I realized I was getting a lot of calls from friends and loved ones and family members of the people that were misusing alcohol or other drugs. And they felt just as lost as some of the folks who were trying to find good alcohol and drug treatment. And I did a little bit of help, I guess, by talking to folks, but I hadn't really given it a lot of thought. I'd spent so much time worrying about and trying to develop alternative ways of treating people with substance use problems with some respect and dignity that I forgot that they're not the only ones who are suffering. And that I started hearing from other people of the harms that they were suffering, and their inability to find what felt to them like an effective and a respectful way of approaching their loved one. A lot of people had been to Al-Anon. Some found that useful, some found it limiting. Others didn't really like it at all. There were some other self-help groups. But people called because they felt like they needed something more and something different. I started a friends and family support group about 10 years ago that ran for 5 years. And that was really sort of the laboratory. The clients in that were sort of the guinea pigs of me learning what I really needed to learn about exactly what's the experience of a friend, you know, a partner, a family member. What's the true experience of living with and worrying about somebody who's misusing alcohol or other drugs? So I feel like they taught me a lot of what I needed to know about what people are going through. Since that time, I've done dozens of family consultations in person, over the phone, throughout the country, and I've learned a lot from folks like the people I've talked to, like you who are here today, and just like I've been wanting to reach a lot more people with the model of harm reduction therapy. I think it's really time to sort of explode this and have a much far-reaching effect for people who love people who are loving alcohol or drugs. So that's why I'm here, and when I tried to figure out what I wanted to say, I thought about, well, why are you here? And so I'm assuming that some of you just found out that a loved one has a drug or alcohol problem, and you are really scared. You might be angry. You might just be curious and sort of checking out the options, but this is kind of new to you. You know, other folks, you've been dealing with a loved one for a long time, and you may have all of those same feelings, but then you may also end up with feelings of, being, your person has been in treatment and failed. They've refused to go to treatment. And you may end up feeling hopeless or disgusted with them. You may develop sleep problems or anxiety problems yourself, or you just may feel like you're worried all the time. One mother that I worked with said, I just can't sleep because I'm afraid he's going to end up homeless. And so for folks who've been dealing with this issue for a long time, you have a whole range of feelings and a whole range of responses that are harming your well-being as well at this point. Some of you may be here because you yourself have an alcohol or drug problem and you want your loved ones to understand you better. You want to have a way of getting them to be a little more patient, of not giving up on you, but not making the kind of traditional demands that they've been making. So you're looking for ways of talking to your loved ones. You may be a counselor or a therapist and just want to know more about how to help families of drug users. So that's sort of who I figured might be here. Did I miss anyone? Is there anyone here for other reasons or representing other groups of people? Okay, I covered it. Good. It helps to think before you talk. Okay, so now we all know what we've been told to do and how we're supposed to act when somebody has a drug problem. We're supposed to run screaming out of the room and go, oh my goodness, not my family, not my daughter, not my son, not my husband, whatever. But what we're supposed to do is we're not supposed to enable them. We're not supposed to protect them. God knows we're not supposed to trust them. And if you do any of those things, you're called codependent. And then you have just as big a problem as your loved one. So that's the standard wisdom of how we're taught to think about this in this country. What we've also been told, and what you've really been told, is that you've got to make them go to rehab. And I'll say a little more later about what I like to call the miracle of 28 days. But that's what we're supposed to do, is make them go to rehab. Make them go to 12-step meetings, because that's the only thing that works. We've been told to demand that they be abstinent now. And if none of that works, we're supposed to do an intervention that will hopefully force them to do what you think is best for them. Harm reduction sees things a little differently. For one thing, we know that the words like addiction or alcoholic or addict lack any useful meaning, that they lump all people together as if all substance use problems are the same, and they're the words of prejudice and stigma. You know, to call someone an addict is to call them bad, that there's something wrong with them. And so just that the language itself is something that harm reduction is trying to change. So we talk about people who are misusing alcohol or other drugs, or people with substance use problems, and get away from the sort of popular culture terminology that feels really disrespectful. So we know that those words aren't helpful. We also know, because a lot of us have been looking into the literature and looking into the research, we know that rehab programs don't actually work very well. You know, that most people don't get better. And we also know that half of the people who need and want treatment don't seek treatment because they don't want to quit. They want to get better, they want help. They may not know exactly what that's going to look like, but they know they don't want to quit, and that's the only option. So half of all people, in one study of all the people who knew that they had a serious alcohol problem, it took the majority of people 10 years before they called to get into treatment. So that's 10 years of suffering and causing harm to themselves and maybe others before they would take that step to enter treatment, because they didn't like what they were going to have to do in treatment. They weren't ready. They didn't know if it was necessary, whatever reason. So 10 years of suffering. We also know that a lot of people get better without treatment and without self-help groups. They get better on their own, but not necessarily by themselves. They get better because they have understanding friends or family. They get better because they've been reading a lot. They get better because they've joined some groups that have made them feel like they have a place in the world and feel better about themselves. But a lot of people actually get better without a lot of professional intervention. So harm reduction is, the harm reduction movement is a large group of people, both nationally and internationally. It started with public health interventions to prevent the spread of HIV and other bloodborne diseases. So that's where harm reduction started. And the definition of harm reduction is that harm reduction is any action or any intervention that reduces alcohol and drug-related harm to the individual, to their families, or to the community. And different harm reduction interventions focus on different people. Seatbelt laws not only protect you from being injured, but protect you from the guilt of having an accident that injured somebody else. So at least you were doing it as best you could. Vaccinations, well baby clinics, speed laws, helmet laws, all of those are harm reduction interventions. It's really only when we get to the idea of drugs and alcohol that we start thinking, oh my goodness, well, you can't just reduce the harm. You can't just offer people a way of being better. That's too radical. So the movement moved into other areas, and a number of us who were part of the public health movement and harm reduction were also therapists and clinicians. And we started working on a model. And I'd been working now on this model for over 20 years. There are a number of different ways of practicing harm reduction, but everyone who is involved in this adheres to a certain number of principles. And the main principle is that people use drugs for reasons. We're not really stupid or crazy. We use drugs for reasons, and we use them because they work, or at least they used to at some point. The other principle is that not all drug use is abuse. There really is a continuum. And I would think that most of us actually know that from either our own or somebody else's experience. You drink a little wine, or you smoke a little joint, or you do this or that, or you used to and you don't now. But there are a lot of different ways to use. And this continuum of drug use is something that we don't pay much attention to, especially in our treatment programs. We assume that everybody has exactly the same problem, and that it's really severe, and that there's only one solution. So we miss out on all of the subtleties of the continuum of drug use. And in terms of backing up just a little bit in terms of the reasons, there's really only two reasons why any of us use substances. And that's either to increase pleasure or to decrease pain. That's about it. That's about as simple and as complicated as it gets. To increase pleasure or to decrease pain. Another principle is that people actually can and do make rational choices, even when they're misusing drugs. When you think about it, everybody who's ever decided to quit has been under the influence when they decided to do that, or hungover, or in some way their consciousness has been altered in some way, and they made a rational decision. People, when needle exchange programs first started, a lot of people said, well, heroin addicts, they're not going to take care of themselves, they don't care. And yet what we know is that of course they care. Of course they come to needle exchange programs to protect both themselves and the people that they love. So we know that people can and do make rational choices while they're still using. The other thing that we've both learned from experience, and also the research is pretty clear on, is that we need to meet people where they're at, not where we want them to be. That the minute we lead with our agenda and what we want, we've probably lost the person. And people need to have real options. They need to have a choice. They need to have options of what they're going to do, and then be given the power to choose among those options. And within the options, then, people need confidence. They need to feel self-confident. They need to feel powerful if they're going to make changes. They need to have the skills to make changes, and they need to have the connections with important other people. So confidence, skills, and connections are the main things that will really help a person deal with a substance use problem. The other thing that's really clear, and that we really all know, we just sometimes forget about it when we're dealing with drugs and alcohol, is that change is slow and we have many setbacks. You know, I always love to give a harm reduction talk sort of toward the end of February, because I get to ask people how they're doing with their New Year's resolutions. And, you know, oftentimes the answer is, not so good, not so good. And so if we realize that there is no us and them, you know, there's no us and them, there's no we who are better, we who are healthier, we who are happier, and those drug addicts. It's we humans who have trouble making changes. You know, whenever we want to make a change, especially in a health-related behavior, we try over and over again, and we get better or not so good at it. And that's exactly the process that happens with people with substance use problems. So change is slow with many setbacks, and one of the main slogans of harm reduction is any positive change. That success is any positive change. And another slogan is better is better. So the treatment that we're developing is based on really well-researched techniques. It's conducted primarily by mental health professionals rather than folks who tend to be in 12-step recovery themselves. It's ongoing, meaning that there's no set time frame, because we know that people tend to change slowly for the most part. And I mentioned rehab earlier and referred to it as the miracle of 28 days. And there's an author who recently wrote that he doesn't understand how it was that we decided that the optimum length of treatment is the amount of time that it takes for the moon to travel around the Earth. And I thought, well, that's pretty good, but I know why it ended up with 28 days. Rehab used to last for months when insurance companies would pay for it. Now insurance companies limit the stay to a maximum of 30 days. And so we've ended up with a 28-day rehab, which makes about as much sense as building our treatment based on the phases of the moon. So that's why I call it the miracle of 28 days. We know that that's not enough. So the treatment models that we're developing don't have a set time frame, because we know that people have their own time frames. Yeah?
I understand what you're saying. Every individual has their own, how do I say, time requirement for them to be fulfilled. But isn't it true that if you do something for 21 days, it becomes a pattern, and abuse has become a pattern in their life?
Mm-hmm.
So would that be one of the reasons? Because you're saying why 28 days?
Mm-hmm. The question is that, yes, oftentimes it takes a long time to change, but there is some wisdom out there that says that if you do something, if you practice something for 21 days, you actually can make a habit change. And that's true for some people, and it's true for some things. It's not true for complicated issues like substance use. For the most part, people, well, and also the 21 days is people practicing it in their real life, not practicing it where you know, they are away from their real life and away from all of the challenges that they need. So I think that's part of the difference there. So it's also, the harm reduction treatment models are inclusive. We work with people no matter how complicated they are. You know, there's a tradition in treatment programs that if you've got a little too much mental health issues, they don't really want you in a substance, treatment program. If you've got drug issues, mental health people don't really want to deal with you. And so that's been going on for ages and ages. It's getting a little better. It's getting a little better, but not that much. And so the harm reduction treatment models are working with people regardless of how complicated they are. And our models are integrated, meaning that and partly because we're mental health professionals, we're trained to address things like depression and relationship issues and vocational problems and psychiatric needs in addition to the substance use. So we can actually integrate all of the different aspects of care that a person needs. And in doing that, what we manage then is to figure out with the client, what are the priorities? A lot of times people come in and say, I'm drinking way too much, I need to do something about that. And as we talk with them, we find out that they're taking care of a dying parent, and they're really stressed. Or we find that they just lost their job. Or we find that there's some things going on, or we find that they've been depressed for a long time. So we find that there are a lot of other things that are complicating what started out seeming like a simple problem of drinking too much. And then with the person, we help prioritize. What should we look at first? Really, what should we tackle first? What do you think is most important? The other really important part of the treatment is client autonomy. It's really been very well researched, very well proven that when clients control the choice of goals and the pace of treatment and the intensity of treatment, that they get better. They get better with those kinds of choices. And the choices range from complete abstinence to abstaining from one drug that's particularly problematic and not from others, from abstaining for a while and then trying to reintroduce the drug back into one's life. There's a lot's been written and talked about in the media just this year about controlled drinking and the techniques and treatments that are available to help people who are problematic drinkers regain control and become sort of moderate social drinkers again. So that's part of what the options are also. And then, lastly, the other thing about harm reduction treatments is that they're non-12-step. So they're not based on a model of powerlessness and disease. They're based on the more complicated understanding of what drives people. So there's some real differences between traditional approaches and harm reduction approaches that spill over into how we start thinking about friends and families. One of the main differences is that in harm reduction approaches, we use motivation, not coercion. And there's a lot of coercion and directiveness in programs of, we'll tell you what to do. One of the standard phrases in rehab programs is, take the cotton out of your ears and put it in your mouth. Another standard phrase is, your best thinking got you into this trouble. So there's a lot of what I consider disrespectful, but it's also really coercive. It's saying, you be quiet now because you have a problem, and you've proven that you can't take care of yourself. So you just sit here and listen to us and do what we say. So and we know that interventions that use coercion, they don't work. And intervention with a capital I, as in the TV show Intervention, not only do those approaches don't work, but they cause intense trauma to the individual. And they often rupture family relationships that never get healed. All with not a very good result when the person actually does enter treatment. And the other difference is that, not only are we not time limited, but we don't know how long this should take for different people. We just don't know. And so we continue to work with the person, even if they don't seem to be making a lot of progress, even if their changes aren't immediate or big. We know that they're going through some process, and trying to reclaim the word recovery in doing so. Recovery has always been said to be a moment in time when you decide to quit using. And you go to 12-step programs, or you go to rehab, and then you're in recovery. Then you've started recovery. And I think we need to back up and say, no, recovery is not when a person is willing to be abstinent. It's when they're willing to be worried. It's when they first start thinking, oh, God, this is not going so good. I'm having trouble at work. My girlfriend is ready to leave me. I'm waking up in the morning feeling horrible. I'm spending all my money. Just the worry is the beginning of the journey. And so harm reduction approaches start wherever the client is at in that journey of recovery and stay with them as long as it takes. So a lot of these principles move into then how I began to think about working with families and friends. That tough love is neither. It's not tough because it's not very robust. It doesn't do much. It's not like, this is going to work. And it's not love mostly because you don't feel very loving while you're doing it. And your loved one doesn't feel like you love them either. Now that they may be wrong, but it doesn't feel like love. And it doesn't actually have the toughness that makes a huge difference. Hitting bottom is not motivating. That's a myth, that people have to hit bottom. Well, if he just suffers enough, get out of the way, don't help them, don't enable them. They'll hit bottom and then they'll see the light and get better. And we know that that's not true. That's particularly not true for people who also have emotional and psychiatric problems as well. People hit bottom over and over again and suffer greatly and cause great suffering while they are sort of bouncing along the bottom. It's not motivating. The main thing I talk to friends and families about is the danger of promises. And what I like to say is promises only cause problems. And the first thing in terms of relating to somebody with a substance misuse issue is to not ask them for promises and to not accept any that they make. Once you say, oh, just please don't ever do that again. Promise me you'll never do that again. You embarrassed me so much. And they're feeling really bad because they know they embarrassed you. And they say, I promise I won't ever do it again. Those promises become problems very quickly. They cause disappointment. They set up a dynamic where your loved one is now all of a sudden to be really, really scared about being honest with you. It sets up patterns of lying and hiding. And so one of the main things I work with families about is how can you talk to and deal with your loved one without getting into that trap of hearing and hoping for and wanting promises. Because, we can't promise that we're going to change. We'd like to. We promise that all the time to our loved ones, whether it's about, I promise I really will, take the dishes out of the dishwasher after they're clean. You know, I can promise that, and now I know myself well enough to know that I'm just not going to do it. You know, but I'm still going to say, oh yeah, I'll do, don't worry about that, I'll take care of it. Well, no, I'm really not going to. Yeah. But at first, I didn't know that I was lying. I had not a clue. I had every good intention with that promise. And so I think, again, there's no us and them. If we think about the ways that we have trouble with promises, the way that we make them and break them or ask them from other people, it's the same with issues of drugs and alcohol, you know, except that there's more shame involved for the person who's drinking and using. If they're in a relationship with you, they probably love you, or at least like you a lot, you know? And they don't want to disappoint you, and they don't want to hurt you. And sometimes it's just easier to lie and to hide the bottles. You know, they just hide the bottles, hide the joints, hide whatever. And keep telling you they're doing fine, they're doing better. And then when you inevitably discover that they're not, you're enraged or scared to death or hopeless or all of those things. And this is the cycle that goes on over and over and over again among friends and particularly among family members. And the harm reduction approach is, you know, of that mantra, promises only cause problems. Is something that we work with a lot with folks. The other main part of working with families in a harm reduction way is that there are no rules except the ones you make. So if you go to traditional treatment programs, if you go to some of the self-help groups, there are all sorts of rules for how you're supposed to act. There's all sorts of definitions of things that you're doing wrong. You're enabling them. Don't give them money, you know. Don't pay their rent, they'll just spend it on drugs. Don't talk to them if they're high. Don't let them come to a family reunion. Don't. And if you do, then what's wrong with you? You know, the mother that I mentioned earlier, I'd been working with for quite a while in this family group. And at one point she said, you know, I said, what's the hardest thing for you right now? And she said, I can't sleep. I said, well, why can't you sleep? And she said, I just lay awake imagining my son dying, you know, homeless on the streets of San Francisco. And without thinking about it, I said, well, I guess you ought to pay his rent then. And the group looked at me like I was from outer space, and I felt a little like I was from outer space, because I couldn't believe I just said that. And then as we talked about it, it made perfect sense. I'm like, this is harm reduction for you. This group is about taking care of you, and what you need is sleep. And if making sure that your son has a roof over his head is going to help you sleep, I think you ought to do that. And so being able to make those decisions, you know, there are no rules except the ones you make. You get to love your loved one in any way you want to. You can sacrifice for them. It's called altruism. It's, you know, in this age of codependency, we forget about sacrifice and altruism. We can sacrifice for our loved one, and it's not pathological. Hopefully you're making those choices and you're thinking about why you're making them, but you get to make any rules you want. If you've had it, you know, if you've really had it and you don't want to deal with it anymore, kick them out. Or don't help them out when they call the next time. You know, that's your right. You get to do that. If you haven't had it, and this is one of the questions that I ask when I do consultations with folks is, are you at the end of your rope, or do you have some patience left? Do you have some ability left to problem solve and to try a new approach, or are you kind of done? Because it makes a big difference, you know, in where you're going to end up. So you get to be done. and you get to hang in there forever if you want to, and make decisions and change your mind over and over again about what you do. So in exactly the same way that we work with the person with a drug and alcohol problem about what changes do you want to make, on the one hand, why might those changes be good? On the other hand, why might they not? Might they cause more harm? Might they not? To really work that ambivalence, to work the complexity of it. We ask people with drug problems to do that, and we ask friends and families to do the same thing. What are your options? What could you possibly do? Let's think of all the options. You could have your son move back in with you. How would that be? I'd rather shoot myself. Okay, we'll take that option off the table then, because I don't think harm reduction isn't about shooting yourself. So how about, whatever. So we generate, because there aren't any rules about how you should do this, we get to generate a whole list of possibilities for how you want to respond. And then you get to try them out. You get to practice, just like your loved one, hopefully, is beginning to practice harm reduction as well. And so along with that idea that there are no rules except the ones you make, is another thing that you cannot enable somebody's drug use unless you're going out and buying it for them. You don't have that much power. Just like as a therapist, I can't enable somebody's drug use. I'm not that powerful, and neither are you. All we can enable is love and support and connection. As a therapist, all I can do is enable a person to come into treatment and stay in treatment. That's my power. I can't make somebody worse. You're not, by trying to demand that the person make a certain change, you're not proving that, that you're not enabling. A lot of people say, well, gee, people come into treatment and you allow them to keep using drugs? And I'm like, could I stop them? No, the only thing I could do is tell them that they can't come back to treatment. And why would I do that? So therapists aren't enabling people when they work with people with active drug problems, and you're not enabling people when you help your loved one. It's a choice that you get to make. And you might make them differently over time, depending on how you feel, depending on what's working. A lot of times, how you decide to work with your own family, your own loved one, is to take a look at your own values. And to base some of your decisions on your values. What do you believe about love? What do you believe about commitment? What do you believe about suffering? We have different levels of tolerance, for one thing, as well as beliefs about that. Are you supposed to suffer for your friends? I don't know. What's your value about accepting people's differences? What are your values about putting up with things that you don't really like because you like other things? It's really complicated. It's not simple for the person with a drug problem, and it's really not simple for you either. And so base your actions on values, identifying what values you have, base actions on that, and then base your actions also on what you can do and what you can't do, and what you can tolerate. You might wish that you could have your drug-using boyfriend stay in the apartment with you while they're trying to get better. You may wish you could do that, and you may set it up in that way. And you find out 2 weeks or 2 months down the road that you just can't do it. So to be able to start thinking about, what's doable, what's tolerable to you. That you may want to be able to provide all kinds of support and love and guidance and whatever, and you may find that you just can't, that you need to back off. The other thing that I'm doing another family and friends support group now, and what folks were talking about recently is how traumatized they feel by all of the relapses that their loved one has had. And a couple of the people, their loved ones have been doing great for months. They've been doing really, really great. And they still say, every time she walks in, I'm like giving her the old eyeball, wondering if she's been drinking. Or every time he goes away on a business trip, I'm calling to see if he sounds high. I can't stop myself. That's post-traumatic stress. Folks who have been in relationship with people with serious drug and alcohol problems may have experienced a whole lot of trauma. You might be traumatized and be hypervigilant, be overreactive, not be able to sleep, be worried all the time. That's a trauma. Those are trauma symptoms. And so you have to understand that if you've been in that situation, that you're going to overreact at times. You are not going to be the nice, sweet, loving, gentle, mother, friend. Not all the time. You're going to overreact and say really, things that you wish you hadn't, because you're coming out of feeling damaged and harmed yourself. So when we think about people who have drug and alcohol problems have triggers. Everybody talks about triggers. This situation triggers me and makes me want to use. Well, family and friends have triggers also. And, your loved one walking in and just having a certain look in his eye can be a trigger because he looked that way before when he was into drugs. So you're going to have these reactions. And it's something that you may need help. You may need help dealing with. Another thing is that that when you're making rules, people are always talking about what sort of limits should I set on the person? What kind of rules? What boundaries should I set up? And there's a lot of different ways of going about doing that, but the thing that's really important to remember is that the limits that you set are about you. They're not about your loved one. If you say, I'm not going to give him my son any extra spending money, and maybe that way he won't have money for drugs. That's not a limit that you can enforce. You don't have that power. If your son wants to keep using, he's going to beg, borrow, or steal, whether or not you give him the money. So you may decide to not give him the money because you don't want to give him money for drugs. Period, the end. It's about you. It's not about if I do this, if I set this limit, if I have this rule, if I have this boundary, then they will change. That's a trap that a lot of us get into. Well, maybe let's see. We won't go out for this business dinner because she always overdrinks when she's at business dinners, and she gets really embarrassed, and I don't want to have to deal with that. I don't want her to have to deal with that. So we're not going to go. Or I'll let her have a couple of drinks at home as long as she promises not to drink there. It's all about trying to control the other person by making rules, setting limits, setting boundaries. So we need to back up and think about that this is about me. This is about my needs, my wishes, my determination. So whatever rules that you make are about you without the intention or hope that they're going to make somebody else change. Because I'd love to be that powerful, and so would you. But this is harm reduction for you. The other thing that I think is really difficult for friends and family is that, especially when somebody, when the person who has the drug problem is actually in treatment, and maybe in treatment in a harm reduction program, that you and your loved one are often going to have really different goals at different times. You know, a lot of people, their loved one comes into treatment with us and they're like, oh, thank goodness, I've been trying to get him into treatment forever. And then they don't understand why their loved one hasn't quit using. You know, and I get the call saying, well, why hasn't he quit yet? And of course I can't say, you know, but it may very well be because that's not what he decided to do. You know, everybody gets to make their own goals, and that's really hard. You know, it's really hard for families because you sort of kind of know what you'd like them to do. You know, you might not be totally clear, but a lot of times you're at the end of your rope and you're like, I just want him to quit. I'm going to quit everything. You know, and so when the person you're involved with is choosing a different direction, choosing a different goal than you would like, you know, that's another point for for compromise and consultation. You know, how can you tolerate you and your loved one being in different places about what they want for themselves? You know. I think I'll just stop there. Jeannie or somebody has a bunch of questions, and then did anybody turn in some questions?
Have a piece of paper, want to turn in a written question, and of course feel free to just ask questions. But if you want to.
Yeah.
Thank you. I have a friend who has spiraled out for the past year or two with alcoholism, losing a job and shame and all the rest of that in New York, and he's doing that a number of times. Is there a set of bullet points from your talk that I can send to him to kind of give him faith that there's an alternative?
Yeah, you know, there are some bullet points. There's also, you could show him our website. Yeah, show him our website because there's a lot of information there. And you know, we're not selling books, but I'll certainly plug one. The book Over the Influence was written specifically for people with drug and alcohol problems.
My friend recommended me come here, who knows you, and
Oh.
the book. So
Okay.
I was before you were talking, I was checking to see about harm reduction in New York City. So
Yes.
I was wondering if that's enough of a resource for him to search out.
That would be, but there are two places in New York City, the Center for Optimal Living and the Center for Motivation and Change are both in Manhattan. They're both really excellent harm reduction psychotherapy programs. Center for Optimal Living uses the word harm reduction psychotherapy. The Center for Motivation and Change doesn't. But the other thing the Center for Motivation and Change has that I forgot to mention is that they've just written a new book, and I think we have a copy of it here, called Beyond Addiction: How Science and Kindness Helps People. And it was written by Jeff Foote and Carrie Wilkins, who are the directors of the Center for Motivation and Change. And it's a program called CRAFT, Community Reinforcement and Family Therapy. And it's a self-help book that's extremely sophisticated, that takes you through a very step-by-step process of how to go about working with a loved one with a drug or alcohol problem.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Say more about how you work with people and the mental health part as well as how you help the person uncover or find mental goals.
Sure.
Understand it.
Sure. Yeah, the question is about how do we help people work with or figure out about the mental health piece. Again, you know, because we're psychotherapists, when somebody comes into treatment, we do a really thorough assessment. So we're looking for, you know, history of all different kinds of symptoms, different kinds of behavior patterns. We ask a lot of questions about what your life has been. So we're pretty able, after a couple of sessions, to see whether there are some significant mental health issues going on. And then we just talk to the person about what the options are. What are the different, how we might sequence treatment. It seems to me like you have a long history of depression, and you were on meds for a while. They didn't work very well. You're not on meds now, and you've been out of therapy for a number of years, and now you're drinking a lot. So it may really be that you're going to have trouble managing your drinking until we can help you some with your depression. And the options for helping you manage depression are these 4 things. So maybe we should begin there. We have medical staff that will prescribe both psychiatric and addiction medicines to clients. So I think that's it. And we talk to people a lot, and we listen a lot, because there's a lot of mythology about, like alcohol is a depressant. And so if a person's depressed, in traditional rehabs, they're told, well, partly you're depressed because you're drinking, and drinking is a depressant. Well, that may not be true. They may feel a whole lot better when they're drinking, that there's still an underlying depression there, but their quality of life is actually a little better. So we talk to people about, what do you think? What's your experience? So we have an expertise, and the clients have an expertise, and we try to put those together. Yeah?
How do you help a person who you know, because you see how they behave, that they have a mental problem, but they are in denial?
People,
There's no drugs involved, there's
right.
no substance.
There's certain kinds of emotional problems where people are really aware that they have a problem, and they're really unhappy about it, like depression, anxiety. People who are depressed and anxious, they don't like it. They want to do something about it. People who have some other disorders, people who have schizophrenia sometimes, bipolar disorder, or people who have what we call personality disorders, they don't often know that they are having a problem. They don't see it. And so, that's a more delicate situation. And we work with that in the same way that we work with a person who comes in and says, I don't have a drug problem, but, they want me to come in. We work with it in the same way, which is to say, well, why do they think you do? What are they complaining about? What's their problem? Basically. Well, they say I stay up all night. Oh, well, do you? Well, not all the time, just sometimes. Oh, okay, well, tell me about that. We get to be therapists. Tell me more. So we just work with people wherever they're at. And if they're saying, I don't have a problem, then they don't have a problem. But they're in the room with me for some reason, and we're just going to figure out what that reason is.
I have a question about support groups in terms of, because I don't know where to send my patients. A lot of times the doctors want us to refer them to AA or NA and stuff.
Right.
But I don't really find any group open meetings that you don't have to pay for, that practice harm reduction. Do you know of any?
There are some. The question is about, support groups, particularly either no fee or low fee support groups that use harm reduction. There are some, but they're mostly alcohol related. So moderation management is the main one, and they use our offices in San Francisco and Oakland for meetings. So on Monday nights, they're in our San Francisco office, and on Tuesday nights, they're in Oakland. Those are free meetings, and they use a book, which is also on that table there, a book called Responsible Drinking. So it's a self-help program of helping people manage their drugs and alcohol. There are we do, in our community-based programs, we do, I can't even remember how many groups a week, but they're all drop-in groups. They're harm reduction therapy groups. You know, so those happen in our community programs, but not in our private offices. So sort of different groups of folks go there. There's also, and again for alcohol, there's the HAMS network, which is an online. HAMS stands for Harm Reduction, Abstinence, Harm Reduction, Abstinence, and Moderation Support.
Well, I think they're broadening out and addressing other drugs as well, because it's kind of hard not to.
This is a question more about, and I can't read it unfortunately, is it more about partners or more about patterns?
Patterns.
Patterns.
I'm sorry, that's not really a question.
Oh.
I'm just very interested in helping to learn more about deconstructing the disease model of addiction that's so prevalent, and it's not really a question.
Oh.
So maybe we should move on. If that's something
Okay, I will, and if we have time, I'll move back to that then. Okay.
There's someone here. who's
Yeah?
got a question.
Yeah, I had a question. You mentioned sort of.
Oh, I think the woman behind you first, and then you, yeah.
Sorry.
You talked about friends and family support groups. Are there ways for a family member to be in one of those support groups without the person who they're concerned about?
Oh, absolutely. So the question is, in the friends and family support group that I do, for example, can a person be in that group if their loved one isn't in treatment? Absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. Yeah.
And we would find out about that by calling your office?
By calling the office and asking for me. Yeah?
Yeah. So.
Oh, I'm sorry. You and then you in the back. Okay, sorry. You.
Okay, great. So you mentioned sort of one of the central tenets of this model is like people need options, the power to choose, and then they need the confidence, skills, and connections that go with that. So I was curious to hear you speak more about that confidence, skills, and connections piece, sort of what that looks like, where that comes from, and how we as friends and family can facilitate those things.
Wow, that's quite a big topic. The overarching theory is called self-determination theory. And it really talks a lot about how we go about making changes in our lives and what's necessary for that. And the idea of self-efficacy, or the little engine that could, is basically what it is. That, you know, I think I can, that is a powerful, powerful force. And when people are told that they're powerless, then it's all up to someone else to tell them what to do. And the more the motivation, the suggestions come from the outside, the less they tend to be integrated. So that's sort of that self-efficacy, that powerful part. The other thing, though, are skills. I mean, what we've learned over 50 years is that part of the reason why psychotherapy has not been very effective with people with drug problems, and that's been one of the big criticisms of the 12-step community about psychotherapists, is because we just thought if we solved the underlying psychological conflicts, that the drug problem would get solved all by itself. And that's just not the case, that there are literally skills involved in how do you manage to not use. Things like drink refusal skills, drug refusal skills, substitution, distraction, building emotional muscle. How do you, what we call urge surfing or butt surfing. When you have an urge, you have a feeling, just sit down, and pretend like you're on a wave and you just surf it. So it's building emotional muscle. Those are skills that are not typically taught in traditional psychotherapies. I can't remember what the third thing was. Connections. Affiliation, connection, love is absolutely, without connections, we don't exist very well. And oftentimes when I hear some people say, well, I have all of these issues I need to deal with. I can't be in a relationship until I deal with all my issues. What I say to people is, you got your problems in relationships. And you're going to solve them in relationship. Now that may be in a relationship with a therapist, may not be in a relationship with, with a person in the real world right now, but problems are gained and solved in relationship, because we're interconnected and we need that.
I've got a question that got turned in,
Uh-huh.
but do you want to read it or do you want me to?
I will.
Okay.
Do you have advice for a daughter who would like to ask her father to reduce his drinking? The parent-child power dynamic makes a complicated issue even more difficult to discuss. That's really great. Having these conversations is really hard. It's really challenging, and when there is that power differential, you have to think about it. So partly you want to think about how nice is your dad? Let's just start with that. Is he kind of a grumpy guy? Or is he generally, kind of nice and easy to talk to? That's going to make a real difference. Does he tend to get pretty defensive pretty fast whenever there's something that you don't like about what he's doing? So first of all, you want to think about who is he? And how does he react when things don't go well? How does he react when he's criticized? And just kind of think about that for a while. And so you might then decide that this is going to go really badly, so I might as well just jump in. And then you're going to get your speech all ready, and you're going to find a time that is convenient for you and one that he hopefully won't run out of immediately. And just say, Dad, I'm really having trouble. So you remember, this is your problem. It's not his problem. This is your problem. You have a problem with your dad's drinking. It's your problem. So if you come from that point of view, then you can say, I'm really, I just realized I'm really worried all the time. I'm worried about you. Or I find that, I don't know that I don't like being around you so much anymore, and I really don't want to lose you as a dad, but you drank too damn much, or whatever. But you have to try and start the approach by knowing who this person is and how they're likely to respond. The other thing is that it is hard for parents to hear their kids talk to them. And at times, it is also really helpful. There have been a few people recently that have come into treatment because their kids sat them down and talked to them. And their first reaction was embarrassment, and their second reaction was, oh my goodness, I didn't know I was causing them a problem. So you might be surprised. You might be surprised, and it might go really badly. And if it goes really badly, you back off, you lick your wounds, you decide if there's a different approach you can use, ask, role play with some friends about what you can do. And then you might try a little, something a little tougher and just say, we've got to talk about this. I have to be able to talk to you about this, because this is really a problem for me. And I'm worried about you, and it's a problem for me, and so somehow we're going to have to talk about this, Dad. And then put it on him. It's like, tell me how and when we're going to talk about this. So there's just a range of ways of doing it, but it's really important to remember it is about you. You have the problem with your loved one. So if you can own that, it makes it a little bit easier to figure out what to say. But these are not easy conversations. One of the things that I hear over and over again, which just astonishes me, is of people doing interventions or people doing sort of mini interventions where they just gather a bunch of family members together, and all talk to the person, is that confrontation is the first conversation they've ever had. They've been whispering to each other, they've been giving each other looks, they've been talking on the phone, but they haven't ever before sat down with the person and talked to them. And so now all of a sudden it's a really big deal. And I don't know about you, but don't do that to me. You know, don't do that to me. I will be very upset. You know, just take me aside and be nice.
I have a loved one who, in the last 2 years, I've been on a rehab merry-go-round with him 3 times.
Uh-huh.
And is it a myth that if you can stop using or drinking for a certain amount of time that you can give it up for good? Is that a myth? Because sometimes it goes 6 to 9 months without, you know, touching a drop or using anything, and then all of a sudden he's right back on again.
Yeah, you know, I don't know that it's the question is, you know, about a loved one who's been in and out of rehab, and wondering whether it's a myth that people can actually get better. Because he seems to go for periods of time without using, and then all of a sudden is using again. That's generally the way it works, unfortunately. People tend to make changes and then slide back. And again, part of the difficulties with traditional rehabs is that you're told that if you don't do it our way, you're going to fail, and you're going to fail big time. So you know, they create this expectation that is sort of one drink, one drunk, is the phrase that's often used. So people are afraid that if they have one drink or use once, that they're going to go down this royal road, and so they do. So that's part of it. The other part of it is that a lot of people who quit using are just white-knuckling it. You know, they're just hanging on. There's other things going on in their lives that they haven't been able to solve or deal with, and you can only use willpower so long until, you know, it just doesn't work anymore. So I think that's the revolving door that we see, you know, is that there's something this person hasn't been able to deal with that causes them to go back into their old standby. Mm-hmm.
On this issue, I consider all of the relapses not to be failures, but just rehearsals for the permanent, change.
That's great. Relapses are rehearsals.
Exactly.
For permanent change. I think that's a perfect way of thinking about it, that they're learning opportunities. There are ways of.
One brings something.
That's right. You just figure out. And the other thing I like to say to people is, you never know when you've had your last relapse. This might be it. We have no idea. You may never have this problem again, or you might. And I can't predict it, and you can't predict it, but this could be it. Yeah, this could be it. Mm-hmm.
I hate to say it, but I have a daughter that have that problem. And I think she decided she knew what was going on, and I actually knew what was going on, and I think we both decided not to see each other again.
Uh-huh.
And we really don't see each other again. Throughout the years, we actually got to see each other like twice or 3 times, and then one time, she just completely went angry at me and tried to attack me.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I didn't know why or anything whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
But as soon as then, we haven't seen each other again.
Ah.
It's been 5 years. I knew that it was a very tough thing, and I knew nothing about it. I knew nothing what to do.
Uh-huh.
But nowadays, I heard that she's doing quite well.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a church that really somehow is helping her.
Uh-huh.
And she hanging on to them.
Yeah, uh-huh.
And one of my other daughters, she kind of hinted about us coming together. And I told her that I really don't want to make a move she have to do the move. That's
Well-
as far as I knew.
Yeah, well, I think that, I mean, you know, you've been really struggling, you and your daughter
Oh,
have been
I have.
struggling for this for years.
Emotionally,
Yeah.
quietly.
And you've made decisions that you thought were the best to make at the time. Your daughter obviously is not happy about some of the decisions that you've made. And hopefully over time some of that relationship can be healed. But for now it just sounds like it's really, you know, that the alienation that she's feeling and that you're feeling are really big.
We both decided, the way
You
I
both
feel,
decided.
We both decided.
Yep.
Because she left me alone and I left her alone. I feel like she knew what was going on. And she decided not to give me the problem by staying
Right.
away.
And now she's getting better.
And I decided to leave her alone in order, because I felt she will not listen.
Right. And she
That was
wouldn't
my
listen at the
idea.
time.
She will not listen.
Right. Yeah.
And if I tell her, more likely I'm pushing her into it.
Right, exactly.
So I decided to leave
You
her
can't
alone.
win. You can't win.
Because I felt I don't know what to do. I don't know. So I better leave
Yep.
her alone.
That makes sense, that you just got to the point where you didn't know what else to do, and we get to that point a lot. Yeah. Yep. Thank you. Yep.
One thing you said has been kicking around in my head, that promises just cause problems.
Mm-hmm.
Do they cause problems when it's the family member making promises to the loved one just as well? I'll love you no matter what you do. I'll be with you always. You can call me anytime and I'll get you. I mean, promises like that?
No, I think that.
Problems?
Yeah. No, I don't think those promises don't cause problems unless there's a part of you that doesn't actually believe it. You know, or if you make those promises and then you find out that you're breaking them. But sure, I mean, those are promises that parents make. You know, it's like, no matter what. I mean, and people in my group, you know, we're talking about, there's one father, you know, with a son who's got a problem, and there are two gay men with partners. And what he was saying is, I'm never going to leave my son. No matter what he does, I'm always going to love him, and I'm always going to be as in his life as he'll allow me to be. And I don't feel like maybe I don't feel like I have a choice, but I've made that commitment. And the other people in the group have not made that commitment. And I know you're a dad, and of course you're going to make those promises, and I bet you're going to keep them. Yeah, kids I think in particular need to hear that someone is going to hang in there with them. And you know, if it can't be a parent, then it might be an aunt or a godparent. You know, but kids need somebody that they can turn to. So I'm going to stop now because at 7:30 they're going to come in and, you know, I think turn the lights down or something. But there are pamphlets over there, newsletters that you can just take. There's a lot of books, some of which I mentioned, that are on the table that you can look at and take photos of in case you decide you want to order some of them. And take a look at our website, which is www.harmreductiontherapy.org.